Well, hey, Reunion, we are so glad you are here with us here today. Happy Mother's Day to you. We really hope that you are starting your day off well, moms, and we want you to hopefully soak in how much we are grateful for you here today. Man, I know that my mom changed the trajectory of my life because of how she prayed for us, how she cared for us, how she did so many things. And yet we also know that sometimes Mother's Day can be challenging too. But today we hope and pray that you'll be encouraged by today's message and what we have in store for you today. So without further ado, we'd love for you to tag somebody, share this on your Facebook feed, and we want others to join in this powerful message that we have in store for you today. But right now we're going to join Kyle and Allie as we worship together.
What's up, Reunion Church? It's so awesome to be back with y'all. Once again, I'm going to encourage you to sing wherever you might be, whether that is in your living room or if you're still in bed with your laptop. I don't care. I would love for you to sing out with me these songs to a God who is for freedom, a God who loves us, a God who is our rescuer, and a God who saves. So let's sing out today. Go on and speak against my borrowed innocence. The judge is my defense. I'm going free. Right when the gavel fell, I heard the freedom. But through the heart of hell, I'm going free. I'm going free. Glory, glory, hallelujah. You threw my shackles in the sea. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Jesus is my liberty. I'm going free. I won't go back again. That's just not who I am. Lord, I'm a brand new man. I'm going free. I'm on a narrow road, it's full of grace and hope. It's gonna lead me home. I'm going free. I'm going free. Glory, glory, hallelujah. You threw my shackles in the sea. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Jesus is my liberty. Glory, glory, hallelujah. You threw my shackles in the sea. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Jesus is my liberty. I'm going free.
constant every day. Every breath I breathe, an invitation to believe you are creating something good. Though the season doesn't tell my story, I know you'll move mountains for me. You're just that good, so I'll give thanks to God when I don't have enough. 'Cause you're more than enough, and you know what I need, so I'll give thanks to God. 'Cause I don't have enough, 'cause you're more than enough, and He knows what I need. He knows what I need. In the silence at your sleep, you're working in the way. Though the future isn't clear to me, oh, trust you anyway. Every breath I breathe, an invitation to believe you are creating something good. Though the season doesn't tell my story, I know you'll move mountains for me. You're just that good, so I'll give thanks to God when I don't have enough. 'Cause He's
Well, welcome everybody. So grateful you have chosen to be here, and happy Mother's Day to you. If you're a first-time visitor here, we just want to say welcome to you. Thanks for joining us. Don't feel any obligation to participate in this next segment here, but this is when we give back to Him. You can text a dollar amount to the number on the screen. You can go online and click the give button, or you could do the ACH option as well, which saves the church quite a bit of money by doing the ACH. Hey, I want to let you know about something on Wednesday at 7 p.m. I'll mention this at the back end, but Michelle and I, along with our guest today, are going to do a Q&A. We would love for you to send questions to info@reunionto.com to join in on the conversation about parenting and trauma and different things like that. And then next weekend, you do not want to miss. It's Brian Hickson, our guest. He's worked with Olympians and thousands of pro sport figures, Department of Defense. He's a consultant for AARP. He's a fascinating guy, and we're going to talk about how God created our brains and how they function and what we can do to help heal them. Well, happy Mother's Day, Mom, if you're watching. You have been such a gift to me, and so I want to give a shout out to you, praying and supporting and encouraging me and my siblings. And of course, I was the baby of the family, so I probably am the favorite. At least that's what my brother and sister know. But I digress. This morning, I especially wanted to say how thankful I am to God for you. And of course, happy Mother's Day to my bride, Michelle, who's passionate and an amazing woman. And I just want to give a shout out to all the moms out there. Happy Mother's Day to you. Well, a contest that I typically can always win is how much did you weigh when you were born? I know, weird contest. I mean, this topic, though, comes up often when someone has a baby, and generally people will comment on how much they weighed, and then people will share how much their kid weighs. And I kind of weighed around a little bit, and then I step in and share that I weighed 11.5 pounds. Whew, if you can beat that, I'll give you a $5 gift card. You can post it below how much you weighed. Why am I sharing this fun fact about Mark McKinney? Because it relates to the topic that we're talking about today. We've been in this series called When Life Sucks, and we've tackled various different things that suck in life, like grief and loss, or when depression hits, life can suck. And we know that there's a lot of good in life and a lot of good things that happen, but there certainly can be a lot of hard things. And so we're doing this series not only to help us work through hard things, but also to see where God is in these hard moments. We also want to cultivate a DNA here at Reunion that helps us welcome any and all people from all kinds of different backgrounds to our family. And today, we're going to look at when you have trauma in your life, it can actually suck. Well, weighing 11.5 pounds was traumatic both for my mom and me. Some would probably say my mom more than me, but after I was born, because of complications, I spent quite a bit of time in the NICU. And for a child being born and spending a lot of amounts of time in the NICU affects them. I mean, as babies are meant to have a lot of face-to-face contact, a lot of skin-on-skin contact, a lot of nurturing, not supposed to be in a clear plastic box with lights on 24/7, with bells and whistles and all that kind of stuff. We know scientifically what that does to a child's brain, and when they are not cared for by a family member or mother or father, whatever, it changes them neurologically. And for me personally, I was affected in various different ways. I struggle with sensory issues, things like tags on the back of my neck or just being dirty. I can't stand being dirty, just the feel and the texture. I also struggle sometimes with ADD or ADHD, and all this stuff stemming from my time in the NICU. Mild form of trauma. It couldn't be avoided, but I experienced it. Now, many people, they have suffered from much more traumatic experiences than me. And when we experience trauma in any form, it sucks. I mean, there are children who spend 6 months in the NICU, children who have had abusive situations growing up, who were abandoned at an early age, military and first responders who experience massive traumatic events. I mean, PTSD is very real. And trauma affects our brains and how they're wired, and trauma actually rewires them, which impacts our daily life and everyday relationships. And if we don't process, work through, learn new strategies to heal from our past, that trauma will continue to reach back from the past, kind of almost making us repeat some of the same things, even though living in present day. Today we're looking at when our When we have trauma in our lives, it sucks. But be encouraged, there's actually hope. And today we have a special guest, as have been the theme through this whole series, because we wanted to give different perspectives on these topics. Michelle and I sit down with our good friend Julie Carroll. We have many things in common. We were both stuck in Vietnam for a season, adopting our children in 2007, which was traumatic. We share a passion for coming alongside the hurting and broken, in particular parents who are struggling. And our families have been deeply affected by a philosophical shift in how we parent. It's called TBRI, or Trust-Based Relational Intervention. That's a mouthful, by the way, which was developed by a doctor named Dr. Karen Purvis from Texas Christian University. Julie is a therapist, a trainer, she's an educator, and she has experienced and seen a lot. We have several parts in today's conversation about trauma, but we will pick up midway into our conversation that we're having with Julie as she begins to explain why she became a parent trainer in TBRI, or Trust-Based Intervention. I'll be back here in a few minutes, but right now let's listen in. Why did you choose to do that?
So I really believe that God brought me to TBRI. One of our daughters had very significant trauma, and I guess the 2-second version is that she had very severe trauma, what some people were calling at that time reactive attachment disorder, and it's kind of the bottom of the barrel in terms of psychiatric diagnoses. We had people telling us that she was a sociopath and just really labeling her a lot. And so we were going in search of support and help to, how do we parent and help heal this child? And everyone was kind of talking to us, and we went to different therapists, and they were saying, you know, UCLA is where you need to get to. She had an experience at UCLA, and basically they said, hey, you know, your kid's going to be a frequent flyer in psychiatric facilities, go get some behavioral training and we'll see you soon. And so at that point, we were just at a loss, like, well, that doesn't help us. What do we do? And I had a dear friend of mine call me and say, hey, I found this thing. It's called Empowered to Connect, and it's in Denver. Do you want to, you know, go meet me there for the weekend? And it was Empowered to Connect uses the TBRI model, and it's teaching parents trust-based relational intervention. So flew to Denver, and with 799 other parents and professionals in this auditorium, realized, oh my gosh, like, these are my people. This is the information that I need. This is what I need to know. So that started a really incredible journey for us.
Yeah.
It's not just training. It's a way of living.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. I know for us personally, we kind of stumbled around trying to figure out how to parent our children who had trauma in their life as well. And when we found Empowered to Connect, it was like, oh my gosh. Thank you, Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah. But full disclosure, I avoided it for a long time. I was going to.
Oh, me too.
I was going to all of these adoption conferences, and Karen Purvis would be there, and she would hold these breakout sessions, and I was like, attachment, oh my gosh, just a bunch of psychology. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to parent my kids the way I know to be true and right. And I avoided it for a long time. And then I was broken down and I didn't have any other choice. And I listened, and I wish I had listened a long time ago.
Yeah, I was referred to the book, The Connected Child, and I remember checking it out from the library and just kind of feeling like, yeah, you don't understand my situation. Mm-hmm. But I really do think that when you get to that complete broken down place, you start to realize this is what you need, you know, not only for your child, but for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we recognize that just trauma doesn't just happen within adoptive families. It happens in multiple different ways and things, through childhood traumatic events, to even police officers, to people who served in the military, to all kinds of things. And so this isn't just for parents with adopted children. This is for really anybody who has experienced trauma. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what happens to the brain when we experience trauma.
Sure.
And I thought for sure we weren't going to have an interruption because we've locked ourselves into the bedroom, but nope, we did.
Welcome to
You
parenthood.
guys talk about trauma, and I'm going to talk to my children.
Okay.
So when I think that Dr. Purvis explained it really the best way. When you think about an infant and a parent, a mother or father, the child, how do they communicate, right? So the children will cry. It's all about meeting needs. So the child cries, they are hungry, they're tired, they're scared, they're wet, they need a diaper change. And the parent soothes and rocks and meets that need. And that's how healthy attachment develops. And it's that relationship that forms the actual physical brain development. And so when trauma hits, there's a continuum. So there can be early trauma that happens. Maybe a child at birth there's been a tiny hypoxic episode where a child has been deprived of oxygen for a few minutes, and that actually impacts the brain. There can be all sorts of different trauma coming through the lifespan, or children can have a relatively healthy upbringing. And then there's some sort of traumatic event that happens in the family: death, loss, grief, parents who have addiction, mental health problems, job loss. There's just so many different things that can impact a family and children. And it does impact the brain. And so when that happens, the neurochemistry of the brain is maladaptive, I guess I should say, and that contributes to the behavior. So basically you have a brain on fire. When we're talking about children, we have a child who's going to be, you're going to see that behaviorally being overreactive to things, and having different behavioral examples. I love, one of the best ways I think that it's been described too, when Dr. Purvis and Dr. Cross were piloting their TBRI program, they brought all of the children, I don't remember exact number again, I want to say it was about 14, but don't quote me on that. They brought children in and they did a saliva test. They did a saliva test to determine what children's neurochemistry was at the time. And all of these children had come with trauma backgrounds. Every child looked mentally ill on paper. And then after 2 weeks of relational intervention and connection, they did another swab and did another test. And after 14 days, all of those children's neurochemistry panels were closer to normal limits. So it's just verification that relationship actually changes the structure of the brain.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to fight with
God's awesome.
Yeah, it is. And it's science. And I think
it is
what, typical parenting and what biological parents sometimes, what I missed is that, when you bring a baby home, you do this, you rock, there's sensory input, there's the eye contact, there's the give and the take, the feeding and the touch, and all of those things that help to calm the brain and to soothe the brain. And our kids didn't get that. And
right.
So many people are like, well, they don't remember anything. So, well,
it's in there.
It's in there though, because they didn't get this. And that's what we go on with life, and we weren't there, so we don't really realize what was missing. But when you understand that relationship and that it started here, and if they didn't get that, how what an impact that has made today on their brains.
I think the other thing too is our brains are amazing. We have implicit memory and explicit memory. And when we think about trauma in adulthood, that you can have implicit memory is something that isn't quite conscious, right? And explicit memory is something you can recall. Like I remember last Thanksgiving, we went to, so-and-so's house and we had this, and you can remember the funny anecdotes from the day. But implicit memory doesn't quite come to the conscious mind. And so when you have, I'll give you an example. When one time we went out to lunch with my father-in-law, and he was a Marine, and he was talking about when our boys got old enough, he was looking forward to taking them out and teaching them how to skeet shoot or whatever it was, And I just remember feeling super uncomfortable and thinking, okay, I'm kind of about done with this conversation and I'm ready to bolt. My flight reaction was really kicking in. And the interesting thing about that was I could not tell you why I was feeling uncomfortable. And in that moment, it wasn't connecting in my conscious mind, because my father-in-law is an incredible, safe, just incredible human, and he would never put my children in danger. But it's kind of later when I thought about that, it goes back to trauma in my own history that was really kicking in. And in that moment, that was implicit memory coming out. And that plays out in our parenting. When you have a child with trauma and they're exhibiting those behaviors and it makes us really uncomfortable, we need to pause and kind of explore that and see what is that?
Yeah, I want to touch on that for a minute. Michelle and I were talking about this yesterday, I think, and she brought up this conversation about how we have trauma or dysfunction in our past. A lot of times, at least old school thought was, hey, just move on, get going. Yeah, life happens. It's hard. It is what it is. That kind of stuff. And yet we still kind of carry that dysfunction into our today life, and it impacts how we parent, how we live out and interact with other people. Can you guys talk about that for a second?
Well, I had mentioned that, someone can brag and say, well, I was abused as a child, but I ended up going to college and I hold down a successful job and, all of those things. But if they haven't dealt with the trauma, how many of them actually have relationships that are fulfilling and completely intact? Or, just because you can hold down a job or went to college doesn't mean that you're successful in relationships.
Right.
They're very different, but yet sometimes, especially as Americans, that's what we see.
Right. We went into our adoption. I always kind of joke that, God used this scrappy little kid from Vietnam to completely transform my life. And I don't recommend just racing out to adopt a child to go experience through this, because you can be intentional about doing it. But, my husband and I, my husband's a paramedic. I'm a social worker. We had gone through therapy together in our relationship. I had done individual therapy, especially through like a graduate school program. And so I really thought, hey, dealt with things, really had worked through that. And we were parenting 2 children and they were healthy and well adjusted. And we felt like, okay, we're doing pretty good with this. And then we brought children with trauma into our home. And what it does is they hold up a mirror to your face of all the trauma that you've had in your life, whether or not you remember that or not. And suddenly we found ourselves not having the right tools for the job. And I was thinking, okay, I have 3 college degrees within child development and psychology, and I am an idiot I mean, how is it that I don't have the right tools for this, right? There was just no way. I couldn't think my way through it, right? So the heart and the brain were not connected. So it really took me not being successful as a parent and not feeling successful as a parent. And that implicit memory was really going very strong for me. And it was through TheraPlay when we started diving in and realizing where we needed to go and how we needed to explore our own attachment histories. That's when we finally really had a lot of relational breakthrough. And it was great. I remember doing what was called TheraPlay with our child. And it's a therapy session that's specifically attachment focused. And it's taking, them back to this with they're facilitating you doing that with your child. And I just remember every Tuesday after that appointment, I left as a wreck. Like I was just a total emotional wreck. My child was a wreck, and we were just a hot mess on Tuesdays. But I realized what that was really opening the door to what I didn't get as a child, and it's deeper than just the relationships that we have and how we were parented. It's not just about, did you have a roof over your head? Did you have school? Were you kind of kept safe? Or what in child welfare we call, the minimum sufficient level of care. It's about how did you have relationships modeled for you? And it really goes back to figuring out your attachment history, figuring out how you can adjust that to be more successful in relationships.
Mm-hmm. And we are doing the same therapy, and it is so uncomfortable. Oh my goodness. And it's on Tuesday as well. So our kids are also but when you start, they videotape you doing these it's not as weird as it sounds. It's like where I'm not rocking my 9-year-old, but they videotape you doing mother-daughter things or whatever, and then you go back and you watch it, and it's amazing what you see in yourself, not in your child, what you see in yourself. And that is just, it's hard to take as a mother. It's hard to take.
Now having the hindsight of being in a better space coming up on 8 years later, I look at that and I think, that getting to that place of vulnerability is critical. I think it's critical in our relationship with Jesus. I think it's critical in our marriages. I think it's critical with our children, that's where you need to be, to have that full vulnerability, to really look at the hard things and stay in the mess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that's a great stopping point for this front end of the interview. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens with somebody who has trauma, and then what God will do in their mess, and what He continues to do, even though we might be messy people, what He does with our stories. So, Julie, stay tuned, and Reunion, stay tuned. We'll be back here in a second. Well, what I love about those ladies is just their heart for each other, and also for kids that have been just really wounded, but also for us as individuals. What I love about the Bible is that it has characters in it that God uses continually, despite their trauma and despite what's going on in their lives. And basically, we are all imperfect, but God still uses us. And a lot of the times, we've had traumatic experiences in our lives. One of the central figures in the Old Testament is a person that God used to rescue his people from captivity, and his name was Moses. Moses had trauma, and it affected him later in life. I mean, we know that he had a speech impediment. He actually told God, I can't do what you're asking me to do because I can't talk very well. We also know that he had anger issues. So much so that his anger got the best of him one day and he killed another person. I mean, that's pretty extreme when it comes to anger issues. But think about the trauma that Moses had. He was born into a very stressful situation. Think about his mother hearing the news that the ruler of the land was sending soldiers into the cities to kill all of the boys. And that stress, when you're carrying a child in the womb, that cortisol gets pumped over into the baby and it starts to begin to change the brain and the way it interacts with its environment. And we know that the first couple of months of his life, of Moses' life, he was actually kind of like kept under wraps. And can you imagine the stress in the home? Anytime the newborn baby started to cry, the stress of trying to keep those cries quiet. And I don't know if you've lived in close quarters before, but in cities, it's really hard to keep things under wraps like that. But think about the stress there. And when I read the story, and you and I hear the story about Moses, I think sometimes we forget about kind of like the details of the traumatic beginning that Moses had in the first few years of his life. I mean, if that happened today, I mean, let alone the fact that 3 to 4 months after his birth, he was basically put in the river and praying that something will happen. And he was adopted through Pharaoh's daughter, which was a miracle in and of itself. But again, all these traumatic things, but I think we forget about those things. I mean, if that happened today, we'd probably say things like, well, I hope he turns out okay, or wow, what a traumatic childhood is what we would say. I want you to think about your own life. Have you ever experienced a traumatic event or just had trauma in your life? Maybe you suffer from secondary trauma because of your proximity to somebody else who has trauma in their life. It kind of oozes and spills over onto you, and then all of a sudden you're traumatized. That's called secondary trauma, and maybe you find yourself being angry a lot quicker than you used to be. Maybe you feel just kind of a chronic fatigue. Maybe you might be suffering from secondary trauma. And maybe you haven't experienced any trauma. Maybe you haven't lived through some things like that, but I bet your neighbor has. I bet your coworker has. I bet somebody in your family has. I was actually talking to my mom about this, and the fact is that when she was growing up, if you talked about going to a counselor or if you said anything like that, you were kind of looked down upon, or if you couldn't kind of pull your stuff together, you were looked at as having major problems and weak. You know, a large extent, this same mentality has spilled over into the church. It's been found within our walls when we deal with issues. Sometimes we give cliche statements that devalue somebody's trauma. But the fact is that we as a church need to normalize the fact that people experience trauma and that there are massive effects that happen through experiencing this. And then we will begin to create a culture and a DNA that welcomes anyone and everyone. We create a culture where it's okay to not be okay. And that's what we want at Reunion. We want people to feel like family. And when you feel like family, you can actually walk into the room knowing that your junk is out there, and you can actually be accepted by that family. And when we are more open and more willing to hear other people's challenges and just sit with them, then that's when that kind of culture is happening. But when we just say things and dismiss it like it's part of life, that's when we kind of create a culture of shame, and also it creates a culture of people suffering in the shadows. And friends, we don't want anybody to do life alone. We want to walk right along with them, even in their pain and sorrow. But if we don't have a culture of openness, if we don't have a culture of coming alongside people, there will be people who suffer in silence. I want to ask some questions. If you have trauma in your life, which, by the way, this Corona season actually is creating trauma for people. There's loss of jobs, loss of income, loss of housing, loss of a way of life. But how have you begun to process those traumatic events or this trauma? Have you taken a deep dive to look at the effects of those things? Have you gone to a counselor? I am certain it was or could be painfully hard to do that. But listen, we were not meant to be held captive to our past. We weren't meant to do that. That's why Jesus died on the cross, so that we could be freed from our past, from our hurts, from our hang-ups. When we stuff it down, when we ignore it, it doesn't go away. It actually comes out in all kinds of ways. It actually oozes out onto other people. But when we live that way, we begin to believe the lie that says, you know what, you see, God can't use you because of your trauma, because of your past, because of your hurt, because of all the junk that kind of oozes out. God can't use you. But that is a lie that the enemy wants you to believe. Moses is one of many people in God's Word that we see him use time and time again. Listen to even Moses kind of pushing back against God, like, you can't use me, but listen to how God presses into Moses' trauma. Exodus 3, verse 11, they've gone back and forth as God is trying to say, hey, you're going to do this. And Moses is like, no, I can't. I'm not going to. He says this, Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I mean, think about that monumental task. And he's thinking about his speech impediment. He's thinking about his quick temper. He's thinking about his trauma that he has in his life. And listen to what God says. God says this, I will be with you. Friends, if you're suffering from trauma, if you've experienced something, first of all, let me just say I'm sorry. I really am sorry that you have suffered maybe something at the expense of someone else's joy or at the expense of someone else's thought life, and maybe you've experienced some different event that you couldn't really control. I just want to say I'm sorry. And to go along with our theme, that sucks. But listen, God is with you. Even when he feels not near to you, he is near to you. All you got to do is call out to him and say, God, will you help me? God says in his word that when we draw near to him, he will draw near to us. Second thing is that he will send help. When you least expect it, he will step in and help you. It's kind of contingent on this next thing, though, and I'm kind of going through some of these thoughts that I want to hopefully help you work through some of your trauma, or at least stay in the game. He will use you even in your weakness. We just have to trust him. I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest hurdle. We have to trust that God's perfect will, that God's perfect strength, that God's almighty power will actually use a broken individual like me, and that we trust that he's going to do the work when we step out in trust and in faith in following him. That's a hard thing to do when we have that traumatic thing in our background, when we have that PTSD, when we have that thing in us that says, you're weak, you're no good, you can't do this because of this in your past. Listen, God's strength will overcome our weakness every time. The fourth thing is that we have to face our past. In order to move into the future, we have to face our past. We have to confront it. We have to get down and dirty. And we have to face our past. And listen to this. When we face our past, we will actually move into our future. And listen to what our future is. Our future is to be used to rescue others from their slavery, to tell them about the healing power of Jesus in our own life, that his grace will overcome just like it did in your life. And you will be used to free people from their past. Free people, free people. It's a great statement that my friend Drew over in Vegas always reminded me about. Listen, God will use your hurts, your past to heal other people. Think about the testimony from Jimmy and Marna a couple of weeks ago. Man, talk about some tremendous hurt, some tremendous trauma, but because of God's redemptive power, he reaches back into their past, cleans it, purifies it, and redeems it so that they could be used to heal so many other people. It's an amazing story. We're going to continue listening into what Julie has to say and looking a little bit more towards this hope segment here on the second part of the interview. But let's listen into Julie, Michelle, and myself. So we wanted to just have maybe a little bit further explanation, Julie, on what are we really talking about in regards to trauma, and maybe even the child's response, even the adult's response to trauma. But what's a practical thing that we can talk about that maybe will help people understand what it is that we're really going for here, as far as like an example or something that we can illustrate for people to understand this a little bit better.
One of my favorite mantras, besides keep calm and carry on, is that all behavior is communication. And I think that's a really great thing for people to remember, that my behavior is communication to other people, and a child's behavior is also communication. So one thing that I think I remember the most about trauma in my daughters was that they would, when our kids were young, our daughter would say, when I wasn't around, she would tell the other kids, I hate you and I want you to die. And she would just do what we call verbal vomit. And it was pretty savvy for somebody that small. Like, what have you been doing? Living on the streets? Like, this is just a lot of really hateful language coming out, and very hurtful language coming out. And so we would call that verbal vomit. And I think I like to refer to parenting as old school parenting. That's when we kind of parent the way we were parented, versus a trauma-informed way of parenting. And an old school way of looking at that behavior would be, oh my gosh, what have your parents done, and who did this? And you either have been in a horrible household, or you are really inherently a bad kid, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not it. It's not, there has to be a separation from the child and the behavior, because the behavior does not define the child. And I think that's really a piece to old school parenting, is that we're placing value on a child depending on their behavior, because that's the most outward thing that we see. But God doesn't talk to us. God doesn't look at us that way. We are all inherently precious just because we're God's kids. We are precious. We may do ugly behaviors, and parents can do ugly behaviors, and kids can do ugly behaviors. But no matter what, the preciousness of the child is never called into question. Their behavior is not okay. So one time, I remember when we would just, in terms of responding to that in a trauma-informed way, we have to do it differently than old school parenting. So when a child would do verbal vomit and saying these very hateful things, old school parenting would say, you need to go to a timeout. You need to go away, go to your room, and think about what you've done. And then when you can behave yourself and use good words, then you can come back. Well, when you have a child that's had a trauma experience, or even typical kids, our boys had very healthy attachment, but even sending healthy kids into timeout for something like that is asking them to do something that they're developmentally not ready to do. So what we're saying is, you go to timeout, and when you can self-regulate effectively and be mature, you can come back and engage with the family again. But we haven't trained them or taught them to do that. So what we need to do is do a time in instead, a more trauma-informed response, and I think a more nurturing, loving response is to say, let's do a time in. I'm going to wash these dishes. You can sit on the couch, and I want you to calm, time to calm down, right? Let's think about this. When you feel like you're ready to talk, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about what happened. Now, some kids can sit on the couch and calm themselves down. Sometimes you're going to have to help them with that. Mm-hmm. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But once they calm down, you have to come back and do the repair. It's all about rupture and repair. So then you come back and say, when you were saying those words, how do you think that made the other person feel? What do you think you could do differently? And come up with a strategy that they can implement. So we would use life scripts, and TBRI talks a lot about life scripts. So we talk about gentle and kind, right? Our bodies, we need to be gentle and kind with our bodies. We need to be gentle and kind with our words. I think the other thing that is really helpful is, and it comes from TheraPlay and TBRI as well. In our family, we've only had 3 rules, right? So it's no hurts. No hurts meaning I'm not going to use my words to hurt anybody else. I'm not going to use my body to hurt anybody else. So no hurts, stick together. So stick together means practically we're going to hold hands when we cross the street when they're little. But when they're older, now my kids are teenagers, stick together means I've got your back, right? I'm not going to push you away until you figure out how to behave. We're going to stay in this relationship together, and we're going to keep doing rupture and repair together. And then have fun, right? Relationships should be a place where we can celebrate each other and be joyful together and have fun and count our blessings, you know? So that's kind of been our operating way of doing things. You know, God doesn't push us away in relationship. He brings us close. And as parents, that's what we need to do, is bring them close and really make sure that we're separating the preciousness of the child versus the behavior.
That's so good and so powerful, the rupture and repair. I really think that people see the way and I don't always get the TBRI thing right. In fact, it's
I don't either.
But it's so interesting that God does use, he really cares about the repair. He doesn't care about the rupture. He cares a whole lot about the repair. And for us as parents, we may not be able to, do something right away, like correct them right away, because we do have to have them calm down. But going back to the thing and repairing that relationship and making sure that you're okay with that relationship is so powerful. And for me as a parent, I have to do it with my child too, because when I don't get the TBRI right, I've learned that there's power, at least I'm hoping, because my kids are still young and evidence is minimal right now. But for me to say sorry to my child,
yes,
I'm hoping will teach them, is another tool for them to see that mommy makes mistakes too, and mommy is willing to ask for forgiveness.
Absolutely.
You keep pointing to me. Am I the child?
But this when we relationship.
When we started, saying sorry to our spouse is really important as well. But I remember when we started this journey with our biological children, we were trying to kind of do old school parenting with our boys and trauma-informed parenting with our girls. And it lasted about 24 hours. And then we realized this is just nuts. We are only going to operate from this new trauma-informed parenting, and we're going to learn a strategy and practice it and then keep moving forward with more strategies. And I just thought, we'll see how it goes. And it was interesting because what happened is we realized that even with our biological children who had not had significant trauma, it drew us closer together. And now my kids hold me accountable too. And my husband holds me accountable. If if I respond in a way that isn't respectful or loving, or if I am short-tempered, my kids feel very free to say, Mom, that was not very TBRI of you, or, or Mom, do you need to take a break? But I think when we model that, we're modeling to them how to do relationships.
Right.
And I think for parents, it's so critical to say, really what this parenting gig is all about is teaching our children self-regulation and how to do relationships. And how do you understand how your brain and body works, and how do you take care of it? And how do you, because if you believe that you're a child of God, you're going to care for yourself and you're going to care for the relationships in your life.
It's really good. We're just about out of time. I really wanted to refer to this conversation that Michelle and I have had over the last couple of years about, even just going back to what you said, Michelle, about how God cares so much about the relationship with us, not so much the sin, even though there's consequences for that. There are certainly things that come with sinful behavior, but even Jesus and his experience with the adulterous woman, where they bring this woman in who's caught in the act of adultery, the religious leaders did, and yet what Jesus did was he didn't focus in on the sin. He didn't say, well, yeah, you shouldn't have been doing that. He diffused the situation, which, sometimes for us parents is what we really need to do, is diffuse the situation, right? And then he connected with the woman. He got down on her level. He connected with her first, and then he corrected. Then he said, hey, look, I love you, but let's cut out that sinful stuff and let's move on. And I think, beyond kids, but even for us as humans, God wants that relationship so much that it's not about so much as the rupture as it is having a right relationship with Jesus. And when we even acknowledge our sin, when we even say, I'm sorry, God, just like it's important to say, I'm sorry to our spouse or our kids, it does so much for that relationship in and of itself. Julie, I want to give you kind of like the last word. It's Mother's Day, and I actually want to kick it to Michelle here for something as well, so that the man's not finishing up here. But do you have like a final 30 seconds when it comes to thinking about this TBRI thing? Like, if there's one thing that you could say to the church, what would it be?
If you are a human, if you are a parent, I would dive into trust-based relational intervention, because it doesn't matter if you had a relatively healthy lifestyle growing up. There is just always so much to learn. And, I've been listening to some audiobooks, and one of them is about Mother Teresa. And Mother Teresa had this incredible quote that she said when she's looking at serving prostitutes or serving people that are having ugly behavior. She said, what we need to do is look and see that this is Jesus in a distressing disguise. And so when our child is having a meltdown or when we're not at our best, we need to find Jesus in that distressing disguise.
Mm-hmm. So good. Yeah, that's a good word. Michelle, just thinking about mothers, and you spoke about this, just in regards to like our past and our dysfunction, and many times moms have this dialogue going on in their head.
I don't know about other moms, but this mom struggles with a lot of guilt and a lot of regret. And I think that that many moms do. And I hope that other moms will find the hope and the freedom that I have found, first of all, in Jesus. And second of all, through this TBRI way of parenting. I didn't get it right when my kids were younger. But I know now how important that relationship is, and I want other moms to hear that it is never too late. It is never too late to find healing. We have to embrace the yucky, and we have to be willing to go there to heal ourselves. But it can be done, and we can have powerful relationships with our spouses, with our children, and we don't have to live with that regret. But we have to be willing to go there and to do the hard work. But that's what God wants, and that's what our children need.
Absolutely.
That'll preach. Julie, thank you so much for joining us here today. Reunion, stick around for a few more minutes as we wrap up our time together. But again, Julie, you're in Camarillo, and you are a parent trainer, right?
I am.
Can they find you in some way, shape, or form if they wanted to reach out to you for any kind of a resource or anything like that?
Sure, I'm listed on the Empowered to Connect website or the TBR or the through the TBRI educators. And you guys are always welcome to give out my contact information if somebody wants to chat. Always happy to do that, or refer you to the right place and get you connected.
Awesome. Well, happy Mother's Day, Julie.
Happy Mother's Day to you.
Well, friends, we are just about out of time. I know that we've gone a little bit longer here than normal, but man, just such powerful truths for us to remember. I want to read a verse to you before we close out our time together. 1 Corinthians 1 says, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." Reunion, we must become a place that welcomes the hurting, the broken, the traumatized. In order to do this, then we have to be more and more aware of people's struggles, hardships, not to dismiss them, but to stand with them in their challenges, and this will bring healing indeed. If you're still feeling like God can't use you, just do a study on people who were broken in the Bible. You will see all kinds of people, from David to Rahab to Elisha, all these different guys who were broken, fear-ridden, like Gideon, people who had lost spouses like Ruth, Moses, who couldn't speak and did some things that you can't believe that God still used him. But God will use you even though you might have trauma. Hey friends, I want to remind you of next weekend with our guest, Brian. He is from the Brain Performance Center here in Thousand Oaks. I'm really excited about it and the things that he and I will discuss then. So please put that on your calendar to join us next weekend. But also to remind you that you can join us at 7 p.m. this Wednesday. Me, Julie, and Michelle will talk more about the things that we've talked about here today. And we want to encourage you to participate in this. You can send an email to info@reunionto.com. There will be a Zoom link posted below. And then I'll send out an email as well around Tuesday or Wednesday that you can click on there. But we'd love to have questions for us to discuss for our time together. So be encouraged today. Know that God can and will use you. We've gone a little bit longer here, but I want to finish out, if you want to stick around and worship with us one more time with Kyle and Allie. And before we do that, let me pray for us and the moms. Lord, I thank you for your goodness. I thank you for moms. I thank you for the power that they have within our lives. I thank you for the blessing that I've had with my mom and my kids with Michelle. God, I know that there are many people who might say I didn't have a great mom, or my relationship with my mother is strained. God, would you restore that relationship? Would you mend whatever needs to be mended there? Will you heal up whatever needs to be healed there? God, will you be gentle with those who might be experiencing Mother's Day that's really hard? So God, I pray for that. But God, I pray that our families would honor our mothers, that we will show them the honor and respect that they deserve for all the things seen that they do, but a lot of the unseen that they do. We thank you for the gift of moms. In Jesus' name, amen. Reunion, I love you. I'm going to let Kyle and Allie close us out with this last song.
I count on one thing, the same God who never failed will not fail me now. You won't fail me now, no way. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the I count on one name. The singing God never failed, will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy. Oh my days. Oh yes, I will. Oh for all my days. Oh yes, I will. I choose to praise, to glorify, glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand against. Oh, I choose to praise, to glorify, glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand against. Oh yes, I will lift you high in my lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy in all my days. Oh yes, I will. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy all my days. Oh yes, I will. Oh for all my days. Oh yes, I will. Oh for all my days. Yes, I will.
God, thank you that you hold true to your promises, God. You never fail us. You're always near. God, we're never alone. Thank you so much for your love and your grace and for your presence, God. In Jesus' name I pray.